Kant's Perpetual Peace, 1795. Immanuel Kant was a Enlightenment philosopher, one of the biggest. He wrote this work in 1795 towards the end of his career called Perpetual Peace, which is his ideas about how we can put an end to war. It's a touch optimistic, but then Kant is known as an idealist. And I'll talk about all of these things a little bit more. Struggling for a title. The Foundations of Liberal International Relations, that one's completely reasonable. There's different ways of thinking about international relations, the way states relate to one another, which I'll talk about more shortly. Kant's Perpetual Peace is a remarkable, succinct summary of the liberal view of international relations, which is still remarkably current. Or, what have we learned about what is possible? Whenever we deal with idealists, especially ones from the past, it's interesting to look, over the intervening years and ask ourselves, well, what kind of a scorecard did they get? Back when Plato said, there'll be no end to humanity's troubles until we have philosopher rulers or philosopher kings. And then you look back over the last 2,500 years and you think, yeah, that didn't work out. Maybe there was one or two. Marcus Aurelius? George Bush. George Bush, like the first or the second one? Second. Oh, the second one. Yeah, a great philosopher king of the modern age. But yeah, it's interesting looking back at Kant's idealism and seeing how he fared. And I wouldn't say he smashed it out of the park, but it wasn't a complete fail. And this interests me a lot. It's what I want to talk about. Or, third point, how could there be so damn much that is still relevant in such a short and easy to read essay? I really like Perpetual Peace because there's just so much in there and it's so succinct. So I say this to the students. I say this is great. You get almost everything in liberalism in about 20 very short pages. So I like that. I'm impressed with that. So yeah, I want to talk to you about it. I want to give you a summary of it and just poke around at some of the ideas and think about and talk about how they're still relevant today and try to get a bit of a sense of how well Kant did in his ideas. This is my overview. Introduction to Immanuel Kant, which we'll get to shortly. I'll talk a bit more about international relations theory. Bit of a digression, but the whole idea of is and ought. Very, very simple words, but unbelievably important tools for thinking about the entirety of existence, as you'll shortly see. And I'll say a few words just so you can understand what I'm saying when I'm saying liberal international relations theory. I'll give a brief overview of the three main schools of international relations theory, and then I'll get on to Kant's Perpetual Peace. There he is there. I guess he was successful enough in his own life that people painted portraits of him. 1724 to 1804, German philosopher. East Prussia. Became Germany, let's say. Major Enlightenment thinker. Famous seminal works, Critique of Pure Reason, Critique of Practical Reason, Critique of Judgment. Difficult texts to read, to say the least.
First major text when he was 57.
A nice point there, Tim. First major text when he was 57. I think about that once a week. Yeah, you're a decade younger than I am, I believe. But yeah.
So I only think about it once every 2 weeks.
Really? Once every 2 weeks. But yeah, whenever I deal with Kant, I always just think, I got so many years up my sleeve. I've got a good decade more of being a fuck up. Kant's categorical imperative. Man, I love Kant's categorical imperative. You like it as much as I do? Oh, yeah. Yeah, you like it? Yeah, I like it. Yeah, you're way too young to like it. It's the best. Act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. How do you work out what's good and bad in life? I mean, sure, you can do all kinds of reasoning and arguing, or you can basically ask your conscience, and you ask it this simple question. if what I'm doing now could become a universal law, if everyone could do it, if I think everyone should do it, then it's a good thing to do. Yeah, I've been struggling with morality for forever, like most people, but yeah, I don't go much further than Kant's categorical imperative. I think, yeah, it's pretty good. Is and ought. We do two things, existence, let us say, every day, every moment almost. We're trying to understand the nature of reality. What is? Then based on our understanding or apprehension of reality, we can determine what we ought to do. Now granted, what we ought to do comes from all sorts of places, comes from genetics, the desire to find food or a mate or something like that. It's pretty hardwired into us. Comes from social ideas, whatever. But still, unless we properly apprehend reality, it's very difficult to figure out what specifically we ought to do. Let's say we want to go to the shops and get some food. Well, we need to understand how the reality of getting to the shops is. We need to know about roads and walking and traffic and supermarkets and, credit cards and how everything works. And then, then you can kind of figure out what I ought to do. Well, I ought to walk that way. I ought to bring my wallet, So what I'm saying is unbelievably obvious, but this is first principles type stuff. We need to work out what is the case, and then we can figure out what we ought to do. There's much to be said about this, but that's it generally. But it gets particularly tricky when you're starting to think about things like human society more generally, laws, or indeed international relations. So what ought states to do? How ought they to act? Well, it depends on what they think reality is. And this is where we get into the different branches of international relations thinking, depending on people's sense of what reality is. Yes?
Kant himself had a great comment on this, which gets quoted by ethicists all the time, which is that to say that something should be done is to say that it is possible. You can never say that someone should do something
Yes.
unless it's possible for them to do it.
When I have the longer version of this, when I'm browbeating people in the first lecture about is and ought, I add the extra one, ought implies able. So yeah, you can't say that someone ought to do something if they are unable to do it, which then gets us back to reality. What in reality are people capable of doing? And yeah, by going through those processes, it's like, I'll get ahead of myself now, but when people say everything's a social construction, and therefore we can do anything, and so you're like, all right, come on then, let's do anything. And then it turns out people aren't actually really able to do anything. So you say you ought to do that, but they're not able to do it because something deep within them stops them, You ought to not be attracted to attractive women. Well, I don't know if I'm able to do that. And so the debate, rolls on. I've put together a little table here. The three schools of international relations thought, the main ones, the dominant ones. There's various other ones, Marxism, feminism. In many ways, they can be kind of mashed into constructivism, maybe with a few ifs and buts. So realism, liberalism, constructivism. Realism's the dark side. Liberalism's the slightly light side. Constructivism, as the name implies, believes that everything is a construction, there is no nature, and it's much more idealistic and utopian. Is there human nature? According to realists, yes, there is, and it's dark, meaning humans essentially want power, and they will kill each other if they can, and they're greedy and they're selfish, all of that sort of stuff, quite familiar. And so the realist will say, you cannot avoid that. You can't say people, how about this? You ought to be nice. Well, actually, how about this? Everyone ought to be nice. Well, I guess everyone ought to be nice, but is everyone able to be nice? If all the world's problems could be solved by simply saying that people ought to be nice, we would have solved them long ago. It doesn't work that way because in reality, humans aren't exactly nice all the time. So we need systems and structures in place to try to manage the worst aspects of humanity, whence the rule of law. But yeah, I'm getting ahead of myself. Realists, there's human nature, it's dark. The liberals are often quite similar. Kant, I didn't include these quotes in this lecture, too many slides, but he has a very, when you read his account of human nature, actually, what am I saying? There's a couple down there. When you read his account of human nature, it's kind of dark. Mankind may be able to escape the fearless anarchy of a lawless state of savagery. So he thinks that there is in nature a lawless state of savagery, but with certain systems, rules, whatever, domestically and internationally, you can get out of that. He talks about the perverseness of human nature, which shows itself unveiled and unrestrained in the relations of nations with each other. Anyway, my point was that liberals often have a similar view of human nature, but I say it's dark, but liberals often also believe in what Steven Pinker, the title of his book, the better angels of our nature. So with structures, with systems, you can block off the worst aspects of nature to a degree, and you can encourage the better aspects. That's liberals. Constructivists, there is no human nature. It's all just stuff that happened in society. There's a bunch of people who are like, well, I'm a constructivist, but I do think there's some human nature. So there's always people that are hedging and sliding a bit this way and a bit that way. But this is the heart of the matter. So what's the prognosis? The realists, negative. Not entirely negative. I mean, realists do believe that war's not inevitable in all situations. You can do things to back it off a little bit. The liberals are more positive, more optimistic. The constructivists are more what we'd even call utopian. We really can. If there is no human nature, then all we need to do is change society and everything will be better. Everything will be solved. So what ought we to do? The realists, we should fear the worst angels of human nature. We should prepare for war. This is something that Sun Tzu from Art of War says as well. We should prepare for war. And our military force should be used to deter so that people then don't invade. Realists are often, funnily enough, they're still often pacifists. They're not often quite as bad as we think. Like someone like Mearsheimer, they don't really want war. It's quite different from like a Dick Cheney hawk who really seems to want war. I don't even know what you'd call them. Not realists, not liberals, not constructivists. What would you call them? I don't know. Warmongers? Something else entirely. There's not really a name for them in international relations theory, funnily enough. But it is a theory. So the realists will say you prepare, you deter. The liberals, you've got to trust the better angels of human nature. You democratize. You try to build connections between people. You don't wag your fingers at them and tell them to be good, but you create structures and systems which allow the best in people to come out, which is what we'll see Kant talks about. The constructivists, for me, it's darker. You transform values. The party knows best. You need an intellectual vanguard of university lecturers to tell everyone that they're thinking wrong and to think the right way and speak the right way, which is, whence cancel culture and wokeism and all of that. Quotes, Machiavelli, a prominent realist from back in the day, a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin amongst so many who are not good. Machiavelli doesn't like doing bad things. He doesn't think it's good to be bad. But he says, if you're too nice, you're going to finish last. You have to enter into evil. You need to, build up a military. You need to prepare for war. Kant is like, well, actually, maybe with a few adjustments, we can fix things up. And as the title says, achieve perpetual peace. Okay, maybe he's dreaming, but still. The constructivist says anarchy is what states make of it. Whereas the realists and the liberals say international anarchy is the fundamental problem. There's no overarching power to make states behave. So states, it's kind of like a self-help thing. You have to just help yourself. Wendt is far more optimistic. He's like, it doesn't matter that there's international anarchy. If everyone's just nice, all the problems will be solved. How do we make everyone nice? Well, you just do what the academics say. Problem solved. You can see where I fit here, you know. I'm mostly a liberal. I'm slightly optimistic. I believe there's human nature, but I believe that with the right systems in place, ones that don't crush human freedom, but allow the better aspects of our nature, the better angels of our nature to flourish, will lead to small improvements. I almost cut this slide, but I do like this question. What if you're wrong as a realist? And what if you're wrong as an idealist? Liberals and constructivists are both, broadly speaking, idealists, you know. They think that a better world can be created that's better than the one we have now, an ideal. A realist is like, no, a better world can't be created. All we can do is try to manage the things that we've got. If you're wrong as a realist, basically, you create the problem. You become Darth Vader, you know, you go to the dark side. And this is the criticism of realists. They say, no, you are not seeing reality as it is. Your view of human nature is not correct. Rather, your dark wishes of what ought to be, namely your love of power and war, you're pretending that that's reality so that you can have more power and war. You see how the is-ought game plays out? So the constructivists say, yeah, you're not describing reality, you're projecting onto reality your wishes. And they're not entirely wrong. That does happen all too often. If you're wrong as an idealist, anyone?
You get invaded.
Correct. If you're wrong as an idealist, you get invaded. As Cersei says from Game of Thrones, when you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die, there is no middle ground. And that's always the risk, isn't it? So what do? You either you become a realist and you risk bringing about the very thing that you don't want to bring, that you think is bad, or you risk being an idealist and you die. They're the extremes, but you know, it's good to know. Okay, let's get on to Perpetual Peace. There are 6 preliminary articles. These are things that Kant, things like, this is stuff we can sort of do now, and if we can get this in place, it's a start. And then there are 3 definitive articles. This is what we really need to lock in to bring about perpetual peace. Many questions that can be asked. Are these articles causal or reflective? Did Kant's writings cause a lot of the liberal transformations that we've seen to some extent in recent years, in recent decades and centuries? Or does Kant's ideas reflect changing ideas at the time? You know, hard to say. I don't know. Probably a bit of both. It's still important when people like Kant come along and lock in the ideas and you can go, here they are. You know what I mean? Even if they are reflective of changing values at the time. I want us to consider the legacy of each of his ideas, and I do want us to think about how effective they've been. So, I have 3 categories. Dreaming, some value, and peace. Again, that's for the Australian viewers. The castle. Tell him he's dreaming. So, there are 9 articles. A couple of them I don't have that much time for. They just are like sort of non-starters. But anyway, the first one is a non-starter for me, but yeah, you've got to talk about it anyway. Kant says, no treaty of peace, you know, between 2 states when you've been fighting and you have a peace treaty. No treaty of peace shall be held valid in which there is tacitly reserved matter for a future war. So you can't have a valid peace treaty if, you know, you're like, well, if you don't do that, we're going back to war. You can't do that. A treaty of this sort would only be a truce, a suspension, and not a complete cessation of hostilities. To call such a peace perpetual would be a suspicious pleonasm. Pleonasm, another word for the day. Look it up. I don't really buy it because, I mean, I don't buy peace treaties all that much either. Sure, you have to sign them, and it's kind of good to, you know, codify things. Codify? It maybe helps a little bit, but for my money, a peace treaty still just reflects the zeitgeist. A peace treaty only works so long as goodwill remains between the states. And if things turn south, then the peace treaty is not going to do anything. So for me, it's a bit of a non-starter. It's like, all right, so you've got to write better peace treaties. It might help a tiny bit, but is it effective? Dreaming is my assessment. But I'll move on from it. This next idea, I feel like it's got a little bit more value. Article 2. It's got this idea of states as what he calls moral persons. Quite like that. And the concept today is, sorry. The concept today is sovereign equality, which we find in the UN Charter. So that's what's cool about Kant. You know, his ideas are right there at the very start of the UN Charter. Kant says any state of whatever extent, it doesn't matter if you're a big state, it doesn't matter if you're a small state, shall never pass under the dominion of another state, whether by inheritance, exchange, purchase, donation, whatever. So a state's basically like a person, you know? Every person has like these inalienable human rights. You know, you can't buy people, you know? They just have this intrinsic value. And so Kant's like, yeah, states are the same. Doesn't matter if you're big or small. To a degree, we respect that today. I often find myself wondering, you know, how is it that Liechtenstein is still around? Is it a state? I don't know. You know, how is it that Monaco is still around? Is it a state or a principality? Anyway, you wonder how small states still manage to exist and they don't just get entirely swamped. You know, how we don't just have a few big states. Well, it's complicated, you know, because you have alliances, so it's complicated. But there is something of a norm for, you know, retaining individual states, whether they're big or small. There's something to it. Kant says a state is a trunk which has its own roots. It's more of the same. But like a graft, to incorporate it with another state would be to reduce it from a moral person to the condition of a thing, which contradicts the idea of a social compact. So he's trying to build up this idea that in the international realm we have something of a social compact where states are kind of like people, okay? He's kind of dreaming because there's no rule of law. It's the rule of law in a particular state which preserves the rights of individuals. But still, it's not a bad idea. And as I say, it turns up in Article 2 of the UN Charter. The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. Now, yeah, I'm not sure the UN barely has teeth in serious matters. It does in some matters, but in serious matters, you know, it's debatable. But there's something going on here. So I think, is this effective? Well, it has some value, I think. Although maybe it's, I don't know, still just something of a norm that's developed. Question?
Yeah, so the thing about inheritance there is really interesting because it shows how much things have changed, because once upon a time states were just seen as things that this or that king might happen to come to own, say through the death of another king or something like that.
Yeah, so back in the day, states moved around a lot more.
Right.
Yeah, so states still move around now. I mean, look, Putin just is trying to snatch up parts of Ukraine, you know, which is actually quite a shock. You know, when Putin invaded Ukraine, a lot of people are like, I didn't think we did that anymore. Sure, there are civil wars within states, and there's various geopolitical machinations and trade wars and sanctions, but the idea that we take territory, it's quite a surprise. And the fact that it was such a surprise also sort of shows how strong the norm is. But yeah, you're right, Tim, that in the past it was far more common for things just to switch around and merge and separate and all of that. Whereas for the moment, we seem like we've solidified a fair bit. Yes?
Is some of the value you see in this personalizing states the problem of scale that Immanuel Kant probably was trying to make states more accessible to the mind? If I see a state as a person,
Yeah, perhaps.
it becomes less complex, less sophisticated, fewer machinations. It becomes a state becomes
A simple entity.
person.
Yeah, I mean, what even was a state hundreds and hundreds of years ago? It was this sort of fuzzy sort of thing of poorly defined, shifting around. People didn't even know what they were citizens of. But yeah, over the last God knows 500 or more years, we've seen this solidification and clarification of this thing, a state.
Well,
Yeah.
citizen itself is
And citizen.
That's scale
Yep.
problem because
Yep.
citizens were members of cities, not states and nations.
Yeah, you had city-states more in the past, didn't you? Because that was a more conceivable polity. Whereas now that we have greater communication and we can travel more, yeah, you can actually have a bigger boundary, can't you, as well? Yeah. Anyway, these are all interesting things. So as I say, are Kant's ideas causative or reflective? Well, probably reflective, but at the same time, I mean, what else do we have at the moment? We have the concept of state. We're not going to have one world. Countries are differentiated. They do have different cultures. This is what we've got, for better or worse. This is reality. So the best that we can kind of hope for is norms, at least, of non-intervention. I'll keep rolling here. I like this one. Number 3. No standing armies. It relates, as you'll see shortly, it relates to the concept today of the security dilemma, which is, Machiavelli articulates it. But, the security dilemma is when, one state builds up its military and then the other state feels threatened, so they build up their military and they build up their military. We see it with nuclear proliferation. And it is possible to back that off, but it's really hard. And so this is Kant trying to deal with this. He says, we shouldn't have standing armies. We shouldn't have armies that are prepared to fight at any moment. He says, standing armies shall in time be totally abolished, for being ever ready, like who's going to abolish them, yes? For being ever ready for action, they incessantly menace other states and excite them to increase without end the number of armed men. Okay, maybe he's dreaming, but it's an enduring problem that we still talk about all day long. Yeah, I mentioned Machiavelli just then. Here's the quote. The fear of one power brought the growth of someone weak, and when that one had grown, he was to be feared. And being feared, they sought to bring him down. That old one. It's a dilemma. It's hard to get out of. But I want to talk a bit about this today to show that it's not entirely ridiculous. It's not entirely dreaming. The example of Japan. Japan's Article 9 of their constitution. So after Japan was defeated in the Second World War, they had the pacifist clause written into their constitution, its constitution. The wording's always so funny. Aspiring sincerely. Surely once you have to say it, you're not aspiring sincerely, yes? It's like, what did the People's Republic of China... Anyway. Aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation, and the threat, even the threat, or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. In order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. The right of belligerency of the state will not be recognized. So, no army, no weapons. We're out. That's how we're going to do it. Of course, Japan can do it by having a strong alliance with the US, so it doesn't quite count. Also, Japan didn't do it. Globalfirepower.com, for the war boffins amongst you. Go to Global Firepower, check out how the different countries are going from year to year. Japan comes in number 7, despite the pacifist clause. USA, Russia, China, India, South Korea, UK. Japan, number 7. Do you know how Japan gets around Article 9? Toyota? Close. Countries have defense forces. You see, to defend yourself. You know what Japan has?
Market, manufacturers.
It has a self-defense force. So when you add the word self to defense force, you're good. You're still faithful to Article 9, and you can still rank number 7 as a military power. Great, huh? Very funny. But I like this idea. I don't think it's entirely ridiculous. Kant says, add to this that to be paid for killing or to be killed is to serve as an instrument or machine in the hands of another, the state, which is incompatible with the right which nature has given to everyone over his own person. Maybe. You should never be able to be paid to be a soldier. It's bad. Very different from this, okay, this is the bit I like. Very different from this are the military exercises voluntarily undertaken and at stated times by the citizens in order to secure themselves and their country against foreign aggressions. So his idea is you don't have, a separate standing army, you train the citizens. Surely there's something to that. And it's not entirely foreign. Does this happen in the world today? Yes. It doesn't really happen in large states, but Switzerland is an example.
Doesn't count.
What do you mean Switzerland doesn't count?
They're neutral.
But they're strapped.
Maybe, yeah, I know, and they take like blood money and whatever.
There's a cost to their neutrality. They have to be able to project force.
There's a cost to their neutrality, and the citizens train and people have their own weapons. But the idea is that, and then this runs through some of Kant's other ideas. The idea is that rather than having if you have a standing army, people are going to be more threatened. If you've just got everyday people, then it's more obvious, let's say, that you are not an invading force, because this is the problem, right? I mean, countries often, they invade first. They strike preemptively because they're scared you're going to strike them. I mean, these are things which actually happen. And so if everyone's just busy being a doctor or a lawyer or a farmer or a teacher, they're just getting on with their life. They're not preparing to invade, which means they're not such a threat to everyone else, whilst still being able to defend themselves. And I was having a big chat with GPT about this, and I was saying, come on, so what? So like even if you're a fighter pilot or if you're like a tank driver and you need highly technical skills, and GPT was saying, yeah, look, even then, you train up a bit, but then you go back to your job. Okay, maybe I could have looked a little deeper, but there's a lot to discuss with these matters. But yeah, it's an idea. It's not that bad an idea. It's plausible. Is it effective? It has some value, even if you're kind of dreaming. I mean, it's hard to see the US or China or Russia doing this, but Switzerland is, it's not. I mean, it has a smallish population, but it's not it's not a micronation. It has some power. Anyway, let me roll on. No debt for war. This is one of those ones I have not much time for. Kant says national debt shall not be contracted with a view of maintaining the interests of the state abroad. Is it effective? No, dreaming. You're a government, you're selling bonds. Governments sell bonds. I mean, who's going to stop them spending money on military as opposed to anything else? It's a sort of a nice idea, but I struggle to see implementation. Number 5. Non-interference. It's a similar point to the one before, as states as moral persons. No state shall by force interfere with either the constitution or government of another state. But it's interesting because, I mean, this is at the heart of the UN Charter. So even if it's, it is a norm. And, and when it's violated, it is still a shock. So it does have some legs. The UN Charter, again, Article 2, very early on, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, it lives on. It's an important concept. I mean, what else do we have other than that as a concept? It has some value, even if it's, I mean, the counterpoint that the realist would make is that it's just large states balancing power, US balancing with China, and all the other states basically fall in on one side or another, and that's the best you can hope for. A certain kind of balance which, prevents invasion. So, if China invades Taiwan, they don't do it because of the threat of war. They're not doing it because of the UN Charter. It's more just like old power dynamics. That's the counterpoint. But, it's hard to say for sure. Yes?
Could you argue that everyone is forced to play at the bigger fish's game here?
Yeah, that's the realist argument. Everyone's forced to play at the bigger fish's game.
The US,
Yeah.
Russia, China, everyone, like no matter, Switzerland even, right? They're
Yeah.
to some capacity.
In some way, they have to fall in with the bigger game. Yeah.
Which kind of nullifies the sort of this idealism.
Yeah, it does.
But it's not realism 100%.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of the realist point, which nullifies the idealism. Which is why I say, is it effective? Well, I wouldn't say it's entirely nothing, but yeah, it's. But I don't know what else you're going to do. The argument runs that, I mean, international relations are a very fragile thing, but we're still ultimately dealing with people, aren't we, not states. And if enough people genuinely believe that it is kind of wrong to invade other states, maybe you then develop globally, people are, less inclined to do it. It's all very slow and ponderous and difficult in the international realm. But this is really interesting. In Article 5, Kant also mentions what we would call today humanitarian intervention, which was codified in the United Nations in the early 2000s as the responsibility to protect. They call it R2P. I hate that. We're talking about people dying and we have to put a number 2 in there like it's the City to Surf running event. Like, it's really in bad taste to me. And I generally don't get triggered by stuff, but yeah, that triggers me. It's just like, yeah, R2P. It's like, no, let's not do that. Anyway, they did it.
Very hip and with it, isn't it?
Huh? Yeah, it's very hip and with it. It's like, yeah, like Gatorade.
I'm imagining some kind
Brought to you by.
I'm imagining some kind of rap with the phrase R2P.
Yeah, R2P. I know, it's kind of grotesque. But it's interesting, Kant says this. He says, what is there? This is why I like perpetual peace, is that these are ideas that we are struggling with today. They're remarkably contemporary. What is there that can authorize such a step, intervening in the affairs of another state? Perhaps the offense given to the subjects of another state. So basically, if, the people in power within the state are, fucking up their own citizens. He then goes to say, but the example of anarchy may, on the contrary, warn them of the danger they run by exposing themselves to it. He also says, maybe you just have to let states go through their troubles, and it's the only way they'll learn. There's something for that, because when you intervene, you just make things worse. Yes? Like Libya. This is a side point, but it's very interesting. Very interesting. Kant's writing this in a moment. Kant's writing this in 1795. Through the 90s, we had, like the Rwandan genocide, and people thought, this is so horrific. Surely, with just a small amount of intervention, this could have been prevented. And we had some, I suppose, humanitarian interventions, Kosovo, bombing. They're kind of grey areas. But we did have one very, very clear humanitarian intervention under responsibility to protect that was developed again in the early 2000s in Libya in 2011. It is actually a remarkable moment because the Security Council, China, I was going to say the Soviet Union, China, Russia, the UK, France, the US. The France, the UK, and the US voted in favor of the intervention. China and Russia abstained. But in that situation, an abstention is basically an agreement. So this was the one time when the Security Council, the major powers who have veto, agreed to allow an intervention to take place. It's also like the very last moment when we could, I'm digressing now, but this is interesting to me. Post-Cold War, we had that happy period where we think, wow, maybe liberalism really will win. Maybe capitalism really will win. Maybe we're on an upward trajectory and things won't be quite as bad. And like 2011 is like the last moment before, we entered, Cold War number 2 with China and Russia again starting to become, much more muscular players on the international stage. So anyway, there was an intervention. Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died, which was a particularly bad thing to say because it makes it look like regime change, not humanitarian intervention. And pretty much from that point onwards, everyone's like, I'm out. That was regime change. Maybe civilians were saved in Benghazi. In fact, I think they were, but it looks like American, geopolitics. But it was a very interesting moment when responsibility to protect actually worked, and we can see Kant's ideas flowing through.
Really stimulated the slave markets.
What did? What stimulated the slave markets?
The Libyan intervention.
Oh.
Never been healthier.
But the country was a failed state for, I don't think it's still not in a great state, a great situation, but yeah.
What you want about Gaddafi? You dump the dollar.
Yeah, Gaddafi. Yes.
I guess it's kind of applicable to the, on a more personal level, to the debate of how to parent.
It's related how to parent. What do you intervene?
Well, do you let them fuck around and find out or not?
Oh, you mean your children?
Yeah.
There's links with all sorts of stuff about how, how paternalistic are you?
Yeah.
Are you a permissive parent, or are you more of a helicopter parent? Yeah, it's funny. My parenting style is more permissive, isn't it? But in the great liberal tradition, I hope that I've instilled in my children values so that they can be trusted to do the right thing without me having to tell them.
Heard this first. Don't turn into Gaddafi.
Anyways, is it effective? I don't know. But getting back to the standing armies, I don't know. There's a lot of good ideas there. What am I saying? This is a good one too. Kant says, show moderation in war, which is always kind of nuts. We're killing people, but let's kill them nicer. My brain still cannot process moderation in war, although the fact is that it is possible and we do see it. Kant says a state shall not, during war, admit of hostilities of a nature that would render reciprocal confidence in a succeeding peace impossible. So when you're killing the enemy, kill them a bit nicer so that when you're trying to have a peace, they're not quite as angry. It's ridiculous, but there's still something to it. Don't employ assassins, I guess. These are kind of old-fashioned ideas. Don't poison. But that's interesting, right? We have a very strong prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. You can bomb cities. You can, blow people away with tanks. But don't use chemical weapons. And, okay, they're used every now and then, but they are particularly odious, which is interesting. Poisoners, violations of capitulations when people surrender. Don't chase them down and kill them. I'll say a few more words about that shortly. Secret instigation to rebellion. Come on, that's all right. Secret instigation to rebellion, that's like the best one. These are dishonorable stratagems. Basically, he's saying, don't, I make light of this, I'm sorry. I get in trouble by students every now and then. They're like, but this is serious. I'm like, yeah, I know, I'm sorry. I don't know. The Buddha laughed, yes? The Buddha laughed despite suffering. That's the deeper message. He laughed precisely because of suffering.
Robert McNamara did
Robert McNamara laughed.
Well, I would say he rebranded this into proportionality.
Proportionality. Yeah, there are many more. There are many different bits and pieces that we see now. Yeah, proportionality and I don't know.
Particularly in talking about the dropping of the bomb.
Yeah.
How in effect ended the war and prevented many more deaths. But
yeah, that's the justification of the bomb. Yeah, it prevented more deaths.
The proportionality ought to govern those decisions.
Yeah.
It's interesting, a really interesting point you were making there.
Discussion is breaking out.
By pointing, my apologies.
Carry on.
By pointing out that some of them seem kind of laughable today. No assassins, no poisoners. There is a list today, but it's not the same list that he had.
Yeah, there is a list today, but it's not the same list. But yeah, for us today, it's more about morality. There are certain things you just don't do. For Kant, it's about morality, but it's also about if we want peace, let's try to settle our differences like gentlemen by just shooting each other on an open field. It's odd. I struggle with it. But we had the First Geneva Convention, the meeting in 1864. We had the Second Geneva Convention, which is interesting. I'm thinking a bit specifically about violation of capitulations. Prisoners of war are in the power of the hostile government, but not of the individuals or formation which captured them. So if you're captured by whatever, no. These prisoners belong to the state. They're not yours. You can't just do whatever you want to them. They shall at all times be treated humanely, protected, particularly against acts of violence, from insults and from public curiosity. Okay? Don't look at them. No. No, but look, but seriously, this is like what America did in Abu Ghraib, by taking the prisoners and making them do horrific things to humiliate them. It's not exactly violent, but it's insults and public curiosity in a sense, because they then take pictures of it. So yeah. But I do think there's something to this. I think there's a lot to it. And I don't know how effective it's ultimately in preventing further war. I think it could only help. But in terms of like a moral thing that ought to be done, we do have strong historical evidence that it was done from Wikipedia. Deaths of German prisoners of war in different territories. I always find this a remarkable table. Soviet Union, similar numbers. They had 3 million prisoners of war, a third of them died. And okay, maybe that's because they didn't have enough food. Potentially there are other causes. It's not just them getting murdered, but it's suspicious. Even France had a million, order of magnitude less, 2.6% died. The United States, 3 million, an order of magnitude less again, 0.2%. And this is the really remarkable one. The United Kingdom, the much maligned United Kingdom of Winston Churchill. The true Nazi of the Second World War. 0.03, an order of magnitude less again. Could even be natural causes. It's so low.
That's in greater danger at home.
Yeah. Greater danger of being kicked by a horse, slipping over in the bath. But that is interesting. So, this idea that we should show moderation at least towards prisoners, it happens. It's done. Kant's not just dreaming in pushing for these things. So, as something of an idealist, I do find this heartening, The realists don't always win. Is it effective? It has some value. I don't think it's going to bring about peace, but it has some value. Move on to the definitive articles now. Kant's got this idea that states should be republican. I'm always trying to figure out exactly what he means by republican. It's not entirely clear. It doesn't matter that much. But the idea is that, the key idea is that the citizens should determine whether the state goes to war or not. And it's a good idea, because if the citizens determine whether the state goes to war, because they're the ones that suffer, even more so back in the day, because you're the one out on the field with the bayonet. But still, even today, you were the soldiers, you were suffering, the hit to the GDP, all of that. The argument is that people will be less inclined to want to go to war. We have this idea today called democratic peace theory, which is one of the most prominent ideas in liberal international relations, the idea that democracies don't go to war with other democracies, and it's true. But it's not clear why. It's potentially because all the democracies are in alliance and under the United States. Yeah? It's a franchise. Exactly. But the more optimistic account is that it's because they are democracies and the people have something more of a say. But another argument is made, democracies don't mind going to war with non-democracies, and America does it all the time. So it's not, But it's still, this is one of the most strongest ideas in liberal international relations. It's very double-edged. America, at its worst with the invasion of Iraq, 20-odd years ago, we need to invade Iraq to make it a democracy so that it is more peaceful, because democracies don't invade democracies. It's, these ideas are used like there's bullshit excuses for invasions. Anyway, Kant says the civil constitution of every state ought to be republican. According to the form of this constitution, the assent of every citizen is necessary to decide the question whether war shall be declared or not. But to decree war would be to the citizens to decree against themselves all the calamities of war. I've said it already. And look at this. Is there any country in the world where the citizens actually determine whether they go to war, even the democracies? Turns out, no. How about that? But even when I ask myself whether the citizens should be allowed to determine whether they go to war or not, do we have time? Look how long it took to get the Voice off the ground in Australia. Do we have time to get the Electoral Commission and put out the ballots? I don't know. I don't know how you would ever practically do it. So there I am. I'm an idealist, and even I think the idea smells a bit. But yeah, even in democracies, we haven't managed to pull this off. So you can have a corrupt Congress, a corrupt Prime Minister in Cabinet, Prime Minister, Parliament, 2/3 of the Bundestag in Germany. 2/3 is quite a bit. President, Parliament. So there are checks and balances in democracies, but they're not that strong.
That 2/3 requirement is quite strong. Do you think that maybe something bad happened to them in the past?
Germany? It's a bit like Japan's Article 9, isn't it? It's a little.
I mentioned it once, but I
got away with it. I'm not going to show the video, but I got more videos to show later in another lecture. Eisenhower's famous farewell address in 1961, where he talked about the military-industrial complex. I hear, almost not a week goes by, really, where I don't hear Eisenhower's address mentioned. Do you hear it quite often? It's prominent, yeah? Where he says, the greatest thing America has to fear. He says, before World War II, it's kind of like the no standing armies thing. We didn't really have an armaments industry. What we had is people that made plows, and you'd say, oh, guys, there's a war. Can you change it up and make some other, make some weapons? And they're like, okay, sure. Whereas post-World War II, they have this vast armaments industry. And even in 1961, Eisenhower recognized that as the greatest threat, he says, to the peace. And it's interesting, isn't it? For decades afterwards, the Vietnam War, all of the US intervention in South America, in the Middle East, the Iraq invasion, the Afghanistan invasion, the country was quite war hungry, didn't heed it. And it's interesting, only now, Trump running as the peace candidate. And he's hearkening back to a more old-fashioned view of a more isolated America, which doesn't get involved in other countries' affairs, which I think is, it's tremendous, isn't it? Say what you want about the man, but surely that's a great policy. But what's interesting, what Eisenhower says is reminiscent of Kant. The only thing that's going to save America, he says, only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. Still that kind of idea that it's only the people that will ultimately back this off. And maybe we are starting to see this in a way. If Trump is elected in a few days' time, which I suspect he will be. You reckon he will be? I'd be surprised if he lost.
I have $3 grand betting on it.
Did you put $3,000 on it?
But it would be a good bet.
It'd be good for my crypto portfolio. Would that be the claim of those who perhaps might even proudly identify as being woke, that they're the alert and knowledgeable?
I know, it's funny, isn't it? Yes, the so-called woke are the alert. Well, you are awake, aren't you? You're woke. So you're alert. But it's unclear. Yeah, it's a different, there's the red pill awoke. I don't know what to make of it, because I don't know if this is just what the Republicans are saying now, that they're trying to pump themselves as the party of peace, whereas the Democrats are the party of war. I'm not sure I entirely agree with that, but the Democrats do seem to be a touch more in bed with the corporate world than the Republicans at the moment. A touch. I don't know. It's a long discussion. Interesting. Effective. Some value. We don't exactly have it in democracies, but we don't exactly not have it either. Sort of dreaming. Article 2, nearly there, two more to go. Definitive Article 2. There should be a federation of states, like a League of Nations or a United Nations, something like that. He doesn't believe in world government. He feels like it's got to be, this is why he's a liberal. You know, the states have to willingly agree to be a part of it. Well, we're still struggling with this globally. The public right ought to be founded upon a federation of states. Realists say that international organizations are epiphenomena. Another word for the day, epiphenomenal. They're not the cause of something, they're just like something off on the side that doesn't do anything. And the idea is that whatever happens is still just based upon great powers. That's what determines what happens, not the international organization. So is it effective? I don't know. It's worth a shot. I'm enough of a liberal to say, even if it's a bit of a talk shop, it's probably better than nothing. Like one of my colleagues said not so long ago, it's better to talk than not talk. Something. And the last one, and possibly the very, very, very best. In fact, not even possibly. This is the very best. This is liberalism at its best. Kant's idea of universal hospitality, what we would call today free travel and commerce. He says the cosmopolitical right shall be limited to conditions of universal hospitality. The wording's not that clear there, but he's basically saying people should be able to travel everywhere without prejudice, without fear. In this manner, distant regions may contract amicable relations with each other, sanctioned in the end by public laws, and thus insensibly, mankind may approach towards a cosmopolitan constitution. I think this is the very best that we have. We travel around, we develop, business connections, family connections. We see that the people on the other side of the world are really the same as us, which they are really. People worry about their families, their children, money, they want security. Ultimately, everyone wants the same things. So by building these connections, hopefully we back things off a little bit, both because of our, recognizing our humanity, but also because of all the trade ties. It makes going to war far more costly. And surely there's something to be said for that. It's like, how much will we lose if we go to war? And people do worry about money, and they do worry about prosperity. So I think that's a good one. I thought I deleted this. Turns out I didn't. This is interesting. Even back in the day, Kant was anti-colonization. It's funny, we look back, the woke we or whatever looks back at the great white men of the past, and they're like, ooh, they're all bad. But even back in the day, Kant was onto it. He believes in, clearly what we would call Western enlightened values. But it doesn't mean he's a fan of colonization. He says, at how great a distance from this perfection are the civilized nations, and especially the commercial nations of Europe. Under pretext of establishing factories in Hindustan, India, they carried thither foreign troops, and by their means oppressed the natives, excited wars among the different states of that vast country, spread famine, rebellion, perfidy, which is bad, and the whole deluge of evils that afflict mankind among them. So he's like, yeah, actually wasn't good. Which goes to show, I digress, but it goes to show that you can look at the West and go, oh, some things were good and some things were bad. How about we condemn the bad and we try to hold on to and amplify the good? It's not that crazy, right? This is interesting too. The Chinese and Japanese, whom experience has taught to know the Europeans, wisely refused their entry into the country. 1795. The English, in 30, 40 years later, found a way to prise open China by selling opium into China, and then that got them to prise open the other markets. Japan was like, nah, we're not having any of this. We're going to rapidly industrialize the Meiji Restoration. And guess what? They then just became as bad as the Europeans. Interesting. So yeah, definitive article number 3. I think it has some value. I don't think it's a recipe for peace, but I think it's the best that we've got in the liberal order. So to finish, 9 articles, It's pretty remarkable. Like I say, short work from 1795, so much of what we still work towards, so much of what we still value, so much of our current idealism today is seen in Kant's Perpetual Peace. So I think that's cool. And the definitive articles are actually basically what we would call liberal international relations theory today. Democratic peace theory, the idea that democracies don't go to war with each other. International organizations, which have some value, not sure how much. And like universal hospitality, trade, moving around. Okay, any questions or comments? Yes?
Just a comment that just seems to me, sticks out, it's very obvious that no one has this figured out.
No one has this figured out.
But everyone's
We are
acting-
so far off.
Yeah, but everyone's acting as if the latest thing is cemented forever. And
You mean the latest world order
the-
is
like
cemented
the latest,
forever?
Like whatever, the hegemony, whatever you want to call it, paradigm, whatever. Everyone's like pretending as if it's this thing that's cast in iron, concrete, and like will never change. And so much has to be done. It's just like this is an ever-evolving project. In 10 years,
Yeah,
it'll be different.
it's going to be different again.
10 years earlier. and 10
I mean, yeah, we thought the US had won,
Yeah.
and then we're just back. China's up, Russia's back to a degree. Who knows again what we're going to see in 10 more years' time? Who knows if we're going to manage to keep holding off the nuclear threat? Who knows what artificial intelligence is going to do?
Can't wait to die in a European field.
You can't wait to die in a European field. Like the good old days.
Like the good old days.
Yeah.
But it's like it's dialectical, you know what I mean? It's just,
Yeah,
everything's always changing.
It's always changing. It's just a question of whether, it's changing and getting slightly better, or whether it's more or less staying the same, or it's particularly bad because we have violent weapons. I mean, I think it's getting slightly better, but then all you need is nuclear war to
Yeah, for sure.
break out tomorrow, and that's proven entirely wrong.
One thing that is interesting, though, is that, yes, things do change, but it does still rhyme.
Oh, it's pretty
Next
similar.
level,
Yeah. I mean, people say that, don't they? That, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. I mean, okay, sure, it's very difficult to go, oh, like such and such is the same as Hitler's Germany, which everyone does. Like, that's not easy. But you can see the inclinations of states. You can recognize the security dilemma. You can, the broader patterns unquestionably repeat. And so you can, learn from history about how to manage them a little better. Okay, I'll finish that one there. Thank you.